And what this group will explore is how do we unlock the value of the assets that California and other Western states have invested in? How do we take that investment and turn it into real economic and environmental benefit? We've got a circumstance now, and John Danner, our moderator, will expose this to you, where we're bouncing back and forth between periods of oversupply and periods where we struggle to meet supply. I won't steal any more of the panelists' thunder on that, but it's an incredible paradox that we're working through. John Danner is joining us again. For those who are new to the symposium, John is on the faculty of both Princeton and UC Berkeley. He's a consultant to many industries and a rather prolific author. Most recently, his book, Built for Growth, which explores how the personalities of business leaders shape the way we build our organizations for growth. That's just rocketing up the business list on the New York Times and elsewhere. So welcome everybody, John Danner.
Thanks, Tom. You know, before we get started, obviously every symposium like this tries to strike a balance between the macro level, the strategic level, the visionary level, and the practical level. So I wanted to make sure I dealt with the practical level right up front, because all of us have been in this situation where you're in the middle of a meeting and somebody's cell phone goes off. This doesn't work in movie theaters, but it does work in classrooms and meetings. Here's the simple rule that you can apply. So this will be the one practical thing you can make sure you walk away from. If your cell phone rings, I get to answer it. And if mine rings, you get to answer it. And that works. The title of our panel is Unlocking California's Renewable Dividend. And as I was listening to Mary Nichols this morning talk about just the dramatic changes that have happened in the space of her career, not just her career, but in the last decade, it strikes me that this idea of revolution that Steve Berberick mentioned in his opening remarks is perhaps the way to introduce this panel. 230 years ago, our Constitutional Convention figured out a new system, an entirely new regime to allocate political power. It was a federalist system. It took courage, it took political vision, it took some luck, it took some guts. And in some ways, we might think about the situation that we face now in terms of anticipating the future of the electric network that we want to create for ourselves as, in effect, our own version of the Constitutional Convention. We're not allocating political power, we're allocating energy power to basically fuel the progress and fuel opportunity for not just the state, but presumably beyond that as well. And in that spirit, I wanted to invite you to do two things as we get to know our panelists. The first is an invitation to imagine. An invitation to imagine what this new reality could be like, thinking about the context and perspective that we just heard from Mary. And second is to maybe think about the new term that we might need to have for this new reality. 230 years ago, people came up with the idea of the United States of America, pretty powerful brand name, pretty expressive and inspiring. Maybe we need a new term to capture the possibilities here. And I'll get the bidding starting, but this is literally an invitation to all of you. My best candidate for that, having listened to Mary Nichols and Steve and Tom earlier, is maybe we call this the electronomy. We call it an electrified economy, a basis of putting electricity, as Mary Nichols says, right at the center of not just our economy, but potentially our society. So with me today, we are fortunate to have four very extraordinary folks. From your left, Steve Chadima, from the advanced energy economy, Mark Rothleder, who's going to make us smart based on his job at ISO. He's in charge of market quality and renewable integration. Jim Sweeney, who many of you know is the founder and director of an energy efficiency center at Stanford. I hate to mention Stanford, but I will. Jim, Precourt. That's fine. That's about the last time you're going to hear something nice from me, though. and Carl Zichella, who's Director of Western Transmission for Natural Resources Defense Council. If you guys don't mind, I'm going to roam around the audience so people get a chance to sort of see you and maybe get some eye contact. People sometimes ask me, how do you do these things? You know, those of you that have seen NFL coaches and the like, you know, this is my dirty little secret right here. The one difference is that I'm not going to be muffling my voice, you know, to keep the opposition from hearing the plays. So I'm going to be roaming around. Mark, would you get us started? What do you mean by this dividend? What's it mean from a conceptual point of view?
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. So really, I think the term the dividend is really kind of looking at the changing supply picture, the changing environment in electricity in a different way. And what I mean by that, because look, I'm an engineer, an operator at heart, and I look at the transformation, and I usually put it in terms of supply and demand and balancing the system. And when I do that, it usually comes across as being talking about the challenges, the operational challenges. And we can talk about that, and we can talk about the paradox of those operational challenges. And the duck curve has been used in the past to describe those. And the duck curve kind of describes one of the first paradoxes. One is that the paradox of abundancy and scarcity. And we've got now periods of time where we've got more supply than we need to balance a system. At other times, just a few hours later, we've got scarcity. We don't have enough energy or enough speed or enough capability moving to balance the system, and we see the effects of that, both in high prices at times and small periods of time of scarcity. So this paradox, as we transform into the new grid of abundancy and scarcity, we need to think about that in now different terms, and really, those challenges are really, we can look at those and look at them in terms of the dividends that is really being supplied. And what I mean by that, let's look at the abundancy piece. What a great problem to have that we have periods of time of low cost, marginal cost, low carbon energy, and we have too much of it. That's not a challenge, that's a dividend. Now the question is, can we leverage that and harness it and harvest it for good? Can we make products out of it using clean energy? Can we share it with our neighbors?
How large is it?
What's that?
How large is this dividend?
Yeah, so when we're in a couple of numbers, when we're in oversupply, we've seen times where we approach 2,000 megawatts for a few hours of the day that we have too much energy. We can't, and we basically are not using 2,000 megawatts of energy. That's a lot of energy that we can do something with. And as we look forward and we go beyond 33% to 50%, we're going to see that number increase. So the amount of energy that we have clean and we can do something with is going to continue to increase. The second dividend, though, that I want to describe is not just what do we do with that energy, but what do we do with the new resources? And what I mean by that is that, and it's the other side of the paradox, is that there's times where we don't have enough energy and we need to have ramping capability. And I've described before in this forum that we need to find ways of leveraging the capability and the services out of these new resources if we're going to be successful in this transformation. And I think we're starting to see the glimpse of that. 6 years ago, I described the fact that we need downward flexibility, and these new resources provided it. They're actually bidding in and actually providing downward flexibility. Now we need to look towards the further services to maintain grid reliability, frequency response, voltage control, local responsiveness to contingencies. And if we're successful in using these new resources in new ways, it will further the effort to decarbonize the grid and ultimately to leverage this new energy for other sectors.
Microphones, actually, this is all for all four of you. The microphones need to be a little bit closer to your mouth because we're missing some audible in the back, just FYI. So do you think this is truly a strategic level dividend of the sort that, for example, Norway and Alaska have set aside dividends for accidents of geology and geography. In the case of Norway, I think the oil fund in Norway is worth something like almost $200,000 per Norwegian. And last year, the Alaskan Permanent Fund, I think, wrote checks of about $1,100 or $1,200 a person. Is California's dividend strategic enough to matter in terms of scale, in your opinion?
6 years ago, no. I think we're now approaching that point where, yes, it is a strategic dividend that we can look towards the future and start harnessing for other purposes.
Steve, how do you look at this issue and even the metaphor of dividend? Is it the right language? Is it the right way to be thinking about this? Do you agree with Mark about its potential significance and importance to the state?
Yeah, I do. The interesting thing for me is what I love about this reframing is that I'm just by context, I spent the bulk of my career as the head of marketing for a string of tech startups. This is classic reframing. This is taking an asset that you've got and finding the true appeal of that asset and essentially remarketing something that other people might think of as a problem into a great opportunity. So I love the reframing, and I think as we do get to 50%, 60% renewables on the grid, we're going to have a huge asset, a huge dividend that we can redistribute. Now, the question really is, how do you redistribute it? In Alaska and Norway's case, or Alaska's case at least, I don't know Norway's, but they're write checks. In this case, I think the dividend is lower electricity rates for consumers in California. Mary talked about economic growth and how the electricity system is critical to that growth. It's not going to be very helpful if electricity prices keep rising and rising and rising unless there's some sort of a dividend from this excess energy that we're creating during these periods of peak production. So I do think, yes, both as a reframing, a remarketing, but also a true cash dividend in the form of lower electricity rates.
So one possibility is to turn it into rate reduction in the way that some other jurisdictions have done. If you had to pick another target, another sector of the economy that might benefit from the availability of this kind of cheap, almost free energy, any candidates come to mind that are now not electrified?
That aren't currently electrified?
Yeah.
Well, the key targets right now are transportation and I'll say broadly speaking, heating. It could be home heating as well as water heating. But I'm old enough to have grown up in an era where the all-electric home was the big thing. And my parents bought one of those. There was a little gold medallion on the sidewalk as you walked into the house. Where it's back to the future, and I think there are parts of the economy that really are in the process of moving back into that area. But of course, transportation is the big one, and there's just a huge opportunity there.
So are you thinking more there about rapid acceleration of EVs at the residential and individual level, or do you have another idea in mind?
Well, the interesting thing is Mary mentioned also the amount of money that's being reinvested in California, particularly in disadvantaged communities and in equity programs from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which she didn't mention my name, but that's the proceeds from the cap and trade system for those of you that aren't familiar with it. If you actually look at the spending plan for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, you'll find, for transportation, you'll find that the bulk of it is actually not going into passenger vehicles. The bulk of it is going into heavy-duty vehicles, into mass transit, into trucks, into ports, into those areas where there is serious pollution problems that result from the use of largely diesel, but that result from the use of non-electrified transportation. So whether that electrification comes in the form of actually plugging into the grid, or it comes in the form of the use of hydrogen as a fuel for particularly transit, large trucking interests, there's definitely some big possibilities there.
Jim, you've often... Is this working? Yes? Jim, you've often talked about reframing in the context of the term energy productivity being the inverse of energy efficiency, which you've spent much of your career and at this center focusing. How do you see this dividend from the vantage point of energy productivity / efficiency?
Well, to me, I start with what I like to call the energy policy triangle. It's just a simple concept that as we think about energy, there are three interplaying issues. It's the economy, it's security, and the environment. And my rule of thumb is if you focus on any one of them and forget the other two, you're going to blow it in your policy recommendations. And just so in this opportunity that we have now as we get a growth of clean energy, if we just focus on getting clean energy and forget the security of the grid, we're in trouble. If we forget the economics of it, we're in trouble. So from that point of view, this leads me to really a very reduced form notion of what we need as an energy policy. Step one, energy efficiency. Call it energy productivity. I prefer energy efficiency because that's really getting what you want by using less energy wherever it's economically attractive to do it. Not every place, but where it's economically attractive. So step one, energy efficiency. Step two, for all the uses of energy that you can economically shift to those energy carriers that are clean, do so. Now, translate that into less abstract language. That means electricity. Electrify everything that you can where it is economically attractive. And again, remembering the energy policy triangle, don't go over the deep end. And third, clean up the way that you generate those sources of electricity. And if it's gasoline for automobiles, as Mary Nichols talked about, figure out how to clean that up, whether it's biofuels or some other method, clean that up. But here in this conference is electricity and it's renewables. But it could be nuclear. I think we've kissed off on nuclear a little prematurely, but there's some economic issues that you need to pay attention to. So it's really only three concepts. Energy efficiency, electrification of everything you can, and clean electricity. Now, for example, in automobiles, you want lighter, more aerodynamic automobiles. That's a trend that's happening. For the internal combustion engine, we use about half as much fuel per mile driven as we did in 1973. And a lot of that's technology. So you want lighter, more aerodynamic vehicles, but you want electric vehicles. And you want to shift to wind, solar, and hydro. But you want this to be incentive compatible. You want the end users to pay attention to the changes that are going on in the prices. I'm using my favorite app right now. It's called ISO Today. Really wonderful app.
Do you get a royalty on that to mention here?
And you can't see it, but you may pull it out. There's a lot of nodal dots in just the day-ahead market that are red. That's over $125 per megawatt hour. And there's a lot that are blue, that's minus prices. Well, if we have really high positive prices and very high negative prices on the grid, okay, some of it you want to do through dealing with a duck curve and make sure, but why not be focusing on that in the end use? Why not have those prices going directly to the end users, who may say, hey, I've got a negative price on electricity. This may be when I want to charge up my electric vehicle or my batteries or my electric water heater. And when it's a positive number, why don't I shut them off? So we really need to change the pricing system to make this all work.
So Carl, what are these folks missing here? Are we using the wrong vocabulary? Is this idea of a dividend just pie in the sky? Or do you think it's real? And if so, what should we be thinking about doing with it?
Well, I do think it's real. I think it takes many forms. I think a lot of the dividends been described by Mary, by Steve, just now, by my co-panelists. But I think we need to think a little differently about it, what we need to do to make this a sustainable approach over time. Our climate goals stretch to the middle of the century and beyond, yet our planning for resources in electricity tend to be fairly short-term. We don't make investments in infrastructure that we can take advantage of in an orderly build-out of our resources that'll sustain jobs and create momentum and keep prices low in renewable energy resources over those durations. Now, we can't predict everything that's going to happen. Technological innovation will play a key role. There'll be new emerging technologies that influence what we build. Well, we do know that we need to have the kind of transmission system that facilitates commerce across the region. Mary talked a little bit about our need to be more collaborative in order to meet our climate goals. That's certainly true. It goes to the point that Jim just made about grid reliability and stability and the triangle that he described. We need to have a system that's much more fully integrated than it is. The CAISO has been in the lead of recognizing that need, as have many of our partners who have joined the energy imbalance market. We'll be able to facilitate more renewable development in our state, creating more jobs in our state, if we don't just think about meeting our own load. We think about meeting also the needs of our neighboring states and taking advantage of the resources that they can provide to us in the hours that we need it. We can build fewer resources to back up our own renewables, which we'll be turning off, as Mark Rothleder described, when we're in oversupply situations, and we can smooth out that variability between renewable energy resources across a very big footprint. We are blessed in the Western United States at having an extraordinary amount of renewable energy resources, and with all due respect, I don't think we need any nuclear to do what we need to do. If we can operate our system more intelligently, taking advantage of the demand-side resources Jim was just talking about, and manage those properly, I think this is going to be a really manageable task that we have. One thing I would urge us all to think about is most of the carbon isn't in the states with the policies. Most of the carbon that's being produced and used in the electricity sector are in states that don't have the same policies we do. And we're not likely to get national policies anytime soon to address those. So the markets are going to have to help us. And we can use these markets as powerful tools as long as we're open to providing access to our own needs from those states, like places like Wyoming, like New Mexico, that have great resources, where we can be backing the coal out of those systems in hours where we have oversupply of renewable energy resources that they can need that provide a good deal, and when we need their resources when they're in oversupply and we can get a good deal on them in the very hours we need to meet the ramps Mark was talking about. We can do this much more cost effectively, much more orderly way, create more jobs, and bring those states along. If you're in a state like Wyoming where 70% of your state revenues are coming from fossil fuel levies, that's not sustainable. But if there's a trajectory where you can develop your world-class wind energy resource, attract new industries to your state, and provide resources to markets like ours in hours that we need it, then we're bringing them along. There's a synergy here in this dividend that applies not just to us, but across the region. We're not an island. We're not going to deal with climate change by ourselves. We have to go where the carbon is in order to make those changes. And we can use our markets and our own needs, our own synergies with these states to provide those dividends to our people in the form of an orderly build-out and long-term jobs, not just boom and bust jobs, and to provide a way for them to participate in the new future that we're building, which is the transformation of the American economy. That's the endeavor that we're engaged in right now. It's not just about California. If we want to solve the climate crisis, it's about our leadership here and helping others participate. It's something we need to keep in mind.
So Steve, let me pick up on that magic word that Carl used, the economy. You are in an organization that has the name about which we are talking this whole day and a half, the advanced energy economy. How is it that you see this future unfolding in a practical way? How do you see the proverbial blueprint playing out, either for California or for the region? But let's start with California.
Well, I think what we've seen so far, if you take the current trajectory that we're on, and assuming we don't get in our own way here, we are in this process of decarbonizing the economy, and that's really the whole focal point of our group, which is, for those of you who are not familiar, we're a business trade association. We have 150 companies that range from solar and wind providers, energy efficiency companies, folks on the demand side, electric vehicles, et cetera, anything low carbon, no carbon, but also a lot of customers, people who are companies who have made commitments to sustainability, and they find that public policy sometimes stands in their way. Mary did talk earlier about the fact that the private sector can sometimes step in and drive things. I think that's been one of the most interesting trends here, and I think one that could affect this current debate is the fact that it's the Amazons, the Salesforces, the Googles, the Facebooks of the world that are stepping forward and saying, I want 100% renewable energy. I mean, the folks in the room from Nevada know this in spades with the defection of the major casinos and also the large data centers from...
No pun intended on that spades reference, I assume.
Pun intended, yeah. So I think I think we're on a good trajectory. But again, by doing what many of the folks here on the panel have talked about, which is, replacing carbon-producing electricity sources with carbon-free sources, and then electrifying everything that you can and being efficient at it, though. And I think the efficiency thing is one of those things that's gotten has gotten less attention than it should. People pay a lot of lip service to it. It's great. It's the cheapest kilowatt hour you can buy, the negawatt hour. But the fact is, the more and more you get carbon-free electricity on the system, I think the pressure to become more efficient, one element of that pressure gets relieved a little bit. I think many of you may find this among your friends, if not your own families. If you put solar on your roof, you change all your light bulbs to LEDs, suddenly there isn't the economic demand to go around and shut all the light switches off. You sort of feel a little bit willy-nilly about it. But I think that then in terms of the overall trends, though, the businesses will still pay a lot of attention to that. They'll still want to be as efficient as possible. So I think really the biggest thing for us is what's going to trip us up. Because I think the trajectory is in good shape. And we can go into some of that if you want, but I think there are some obvious hurdles in our way at the moment, and we just have to figure out how to deal with them and get around them.
Let's come back to those in a second. Mark, I'm noticing this lovely graphic behind you. It reminds me, sometimes when we have MBAs coming to Berkeley, we ask them, why are you going to spend the equivalent of $250,000 to $400,000 by the time you've given up salary, you've paid tuition, et cetera, to get an MBA? And about a third of the students say, well, we're really interested in getting into or getting at a higher level of management consulting. And what I often say to those folks is, to be an effective management consultant, you really only need to know two geometric frameworks. One is the 2x2 matrix, because that shows that you're capable of classifying things and separating them, and that's what launched the Boston Consulting Group and others on a worldwide empire. But the other is the Venn diagram, which is a higher form of intelligence because it shows that you can actually connect things, not just categorize them. So what do you mean by this lovely Venn diagram behind you?
So what I'm attempting to convey with this Venn diagram is that if to be successful and really continue to harvest the renewable resources, the clean resources for the economy, I think there does have to be an alignment between technology, the market, and contracts, or maybe, like Jim said, maybe the policy is the third piece of this. And if you can align those, then you create the right incentives to make sure the technology is supportive of the objectives of decarbonizing the grid, but also reducing carbon overall in the economy. But it then feeds back, in my space, to actually enhance the reliability of the grid.
Give us some examples.
Okay, so some examples of this are, well, like I said, 5 years ago we were talking about the concern about having oversupply, and we talked about the need for the new resources to actually economically bid to the system so that we can dispatch them and shape their production. And we did that, and we've seen a good outcome of being able to shape using the new resources. I think we now need to take that to the next level, and that next level is extracting the grid services from those resources. And right now I'm seeing that there's not a perfect alignment between technology, the market, and the contracts. And in fact, in a way, the objective of maximizing renewable energy is at potentially at odds at times with maintaining grid reliability or extracting those energy services that we need to maintain reliability.
So is the challenge that we have increasingly smarter resources hobbled by, in effect, simple-minded, maybe even dumber contracts?
I think technology is way beyond ahead of the curve. Okay, the technology and the capability of innovation is beyond and ahead of the curve.
So if you assume that power purchase agreements are the currency of the realm in terms of the contract circle here on your diagram, what would a new kind of agreement look like that would release or unlock the potential of the dividend that you've talked about? Would it be something like a GPA? We need to improve the grid's GPA, not grade point average, obviously, but maybe what we need is a new contractual vehicle, the grid partner agreement, that captures more of the keyboard of possibilities and capabilities that these new resources. Does that make sense, or how would you restructure some of these contracts?
It does make sense, and it needs to be mutually beneficial. The resource, the investor in that new technology and the resource needs to be motivated to make that available. The off-taker needs to be willing to pay and understand what they're paying for and the benefit they're paying for getting that grid service extracted from that resource.
Who loses in that potential shift from contracting framework, from what we have today to what we might need in the future? Who stands to lose?
I think the only people who lose is if that alignment doesn't happen, because I think then you have inefficiencies and potentially degradation of reliability. I think if it happens, no one loses, because I think you can always write contracts in a way that basically share the benefit of the commodity.
So Carl, you talk about needing to think more ecumenically, and Jim, you mentioned the need for an overarching or maybe underpinning policy framework that allows this triangle that you described to us earlier. How do you see the next steps of this playing out in some practical way? And I mean practical not just technologically, but practical politically, given the fact that most jurisdictions and most parties have what some people might call the sort of WIFM mentality, W-I-I-F-M, what's in it for me. How do you satisfy the what's in it for me, self-focused nature of decision-making for most of the players that we're talking about, and get to that policy framework, Jim, that you talk about, or the ecumenical thinking, Carl, that you're advocating?
Who are you asking?
Go ahead, Jim.
Go ahead, Jim.
So, first, we have, right from the beginning, understand that we should be dispatching the supply side of the grid. And we have a little harder problem dispatching solar and wind, but it's a concept that's very dear to everybody in electricity, that the supply side is dispatchable. Well, what I'm saying is the demand side should be just as dispatchable. That adjustments up and down can happen rapidly for some parts of the demand system and some parts can't. But there's a difference. On the supply side, the generators, you can have the ISO say you're on, you're off based upon the contracts. On the demand side, if you go to all of the millions of people in California and the businesses, you really don't want the ISO saying, okay, you can turn on your television now, you can't turn it on later. You can heat your water now, you can charge your car now. You want freedom. And what you want in order to accomplish the dispatchability of grid, you need a contractual compatibility on the demand side. That may be real-time prices for the big users. So when the price is negative on the grid, well, you can help solve the problem by charging your car at that time or charging your Tesla batteries or do many other things. If you're a large industry, there's many ways you can pre-use the heat. Stanford has a system that is like that.
So we substitute transparent pricing that maps more the reality of the economics of the system as it exists in the moment, rather than each of us as individuals signing our own little mini power purchase agreements.
Right. We want transparent pricing, but for the large industrial customers, there's a whole new set of contracts that you can give that allows a aggregator, demand side management aggregator, to control your system, to cycle your system. So it's a contract for individuals. You want pricing. For large industries, you want the right to have pricing, the right to have contracts. But the bottom line is we need to have the demand side as responsive as it can economically attractively do, and not keep thinking just on the supply side for dispatching.
So Carl, you spend most of your time thinking not so much about the demand side and not even to some extent about the generation side. You're responsible for the Western transmission part of your organization. What's been missing so far in terms of practical steps that you've heard from your colleagues on the panel?
Well, I think the obvious one is reconfiguring how the system is structured and how it operates. Right now, I think everyone in the room knows we have 38 different balancing areas in the West. There are huge inefficiencies associated with every one of them, balancing load and demand and supply within their footprints, and great efficiencies, as we've seen from some of the studies that have been done about the ISO's expansion proposals, to eliminating some of that duplication and unnecessary structuring. So I do think when we talk about transmission, we're talking about more efficient use of the system, more longer-term planning in terms of the build-out of the assets of the system, looking at multiple values of transmission that's being proposed, and trying to select that transmission which serves more of them. This is not a new idea, by the way. They do this in MISO right now, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. And also looking at location of both the resources and the wires as part of the planning process. Where do the resources have the greatest value, capacity value for California, and where would our resources have the most value for others? So we know that wind in other parts of the West is uncorrelated in its variability to the wind that we produce. It's going to operate in hours where we need it. Trying to plan the system to capture those benefits so that we can build fewer backup resources, that we can stop running gas plants at the performance minimum and reduce the pollution loads in some of our communities that Mary was referring to, as we capture other benefits by electrifying the economy. By operating the system more efficiently, we also can prevent emissions from plants that we don't need to be running just so they can cycle for a few hours in the evening. So it really is in a broad category of operations and planning for the system, but doing that in a much more holistic way than just looking at all these different balancing areas or looking at 4 different regional planning groups across the West. We need to look at the West as an entire resource, much as people in Germany, as Steve was talking about, bringing folks from Germany so we can learn a little bit from them about how they're using Northern Europe, like Norway, with their hydro resources to help us help them manage their variability, just as we can do with the Bonneville Power Administration, for example.
I was struck by the analogy with the Constitutional Convention. I was thinking about the 13 colonies as 13 balancing authorities in search of some kind of federal system that allows them to retain their independence while getting the benefits of cooperation and collaboration. Steve, you mentioned earlier, if we don't get in our way, what do you think could get in our way of achieving the real potential of the dividend that we've been discussing?
So you actually, the great segue from what you just mentioned, it's that Constitutional Convention, or our equivalent of it. It's politics, basically. We're in a situation where, unfortunately, for better or for worse, energy has become a politicized topic. Nationally, as well as here in California. And I suppose it's naive to think that anything where public policy is so critical an element would not automatically attract politics. But it's becoming a challenge. In fact, Carl mentioned MISO. Anybody who has dealt with any of these other regional transmission organizations or ISOs understands the governance structures of those organizations were agreed to in fairly, predictable and fair ways, because they didn't start with any preconceived notion other than they needed to construct a governing body that reflected the constituencies that were being served. We didn't make the mistake of starting a California ISO, but because we're starting with a California ISO, those folks, particularly political leaders who are invested in the current structure, are very reluctant to give up what they perceive as control over this independent nonprofit corporation. Not much control, actually, but perceived control. If we had started the conversation without Cal ISO in the picture, it would have been much easier to come to some sort of a reasonable conclusion about how to govern a Western organization, but we're not. And this goes both ways. It's both Californians, political leaders in California, but it's also throughout the West. I won't name this person by name, but one of the commissioners from one of the states, nearby states, came up to me one day and was doing one of these chest pointing things at me. We're not turning over the control of our grid and our utilities to the governor of California. And I just thought, oh boy, this is wrong on so many levels. How do I wind this down into a reasonable conversation? But that's what we're dealing with. And I think there's got to be a way for us to reframe this conversation about the kinds of things that really appeal to the political leaders, not only in California, but also elsewhere. And I think that really is around the economic benefits and the benefits to electricity ratepayers that really will come from this, and hopefully try to push aside some of the sort of more parochial and short-term political considerations. But I think that's largely the challenge for us. I don't think there are obviously technical challenges here, but they're not insurmountable. People work on these things, they know them, they're fact-based, people can work on those kinds of things out of the limelight. But I think it's the political aspect that really could end up tripping us up in the end.
So you're suggesting almost a different triangle than the one that Jim introduced initially. I sense that all four of you think that the problems here are not practical, nor are they technological necessarily, that we're really caught between two other points of the triangle. One is the rational, and the other is the political. How is it that we crack through that? If everybody acknowledges that regionalization would be such a fine thing, that it makes sense from an environmental point of view, could even make sense economically, but hasn't yet adjusted the political calculus of the parties who would need to agree to it, how do you break through that, potentially? Carl?
Yeah, let me just say, I think there's been a lot of conversations between all the states in the West about how this might happen. I see in the audience that there are some folks here who have helped coordinate that conversation, like Commissioner Rendall from Washington. I don't think we're that far apart. I think people recognize that there are major benefits for everyone. that there are certain trends that are immutable at this point. Nobody's bringing coal back from the brink, for example. I don't know a single analyst that projects a revival of the coal industry. So there are transitions that are in everyone's interest to make the most of. In places like Wyoming, there's a major effort to try to diversify the economy, and they're interested in markets. They understand that markets can help them have access not only to cheaper electricity, but also to provide a market for the electricity they can produce. So what I was talking about earlier, of everyone having a stake in the transformation. We can make this happen. People can recognize that, but there are certain tenets that have to be observed. The independence of the states to have their own energy policies. We don't need to tell Wyoming that they need to scotch coal. You know, that's happening anyway. What we need to do is to say, well, buy your wind. You know, let's have a market in which everyone can benefit. California's policies, we have just an equal interest in preserving our own policies, which Mary detailed are numerous and visionary. Other states want to do the same thing. So there's a common interest there of not transgressing against each other's sovereignty, if you will.
So I mentioned earlier that we try to bridge the gap between the strategic and the practical. Let me invite each of you to think about 1, 2, no more than 3 very specific steps that you think various players in the marketplace, in the regulatory environment, need to be taking now in order to realize the potential that each of the 4 of you agree is there from this renewables dividend. And maybe along the way, describe to us how you see, if any, changes in the rules and the roles that might be played by these organizations. So I'm happy to take whoever wants to volunteer first. Otherwise, I'll call on you because I'm used to doing cold calling if necessary.
I'll go first. So let me back it up a little bit to some of the threats or the potential, what could stop us along the way. I think the political is one, but I think the other one I have concern about is that as you transition from an energy-based economy that was driven based off of kind of market prices, marginal prices, and you start to see the transition to a low marginal price, do we lose the economic fuel to continue to innovate and keep it moving along? And I think you do, but you have to start now transitioning from the perspective of energy value, and you have to start changing the mentality of shaping value, service value, and security value.
And how do you get economic? How do you get?
I think those are the 3 themes that I think keep you moving along with, well, let me add to that. Shaping value. Can we shape the electricity or shape the demand so that they're balanced? Okay, and are we incentivizing that shaping to occur? Services. Moving away from energy, we need to compensate and recognize what services keep reliability in the system going. Frequency response, voltage control, and we need to value those services. And they're not the same, they're not going to have the same monetary magnitude that we talk about energy. We know what energy is based on fuel cost, $30, $40 on the margin. But as the margin of value of energy, and we have no resources that have low marginal costs, we have to start thinking about what's the value of the services and what is the value of that, and are we valuing compensating those?
And you are talking about the economic value
Yes.
of these different
Yes.
capabilities.
Yeah, because if you ask for the right things and you compensate for the right things, those things will innovate and come to the market. And I think from a security perspective, it has various components, but we talked about already security of climate change. And we've already have mechanisms to monetize the decarbonization. And I think if we continue that will ensure or help us on the security. But there's also lower level security, information security. We need, as we distribute the resources out across the system, we need to make sure that it's in a secure way and that we don't jeopardize security. And if we do that correctly, we get security back through resiliency, okay? And I think that's where, in my mind, is starting to shape, is that if we focus on those and make sure we value those, shaping, services, and security, we will help transition and keep the right things in mind along the way.
Jim, you got a candidate for something that takes your strategic vision and grounds it in one or two very specific short-term pragmatic actions that you think a particular player should take or not.
Yes, first I want to endorse exactly what we heard about regionalizing the grid. I think the politics actually started in just before the Western electricity crisis in 2000, when California insisted that the independent system operator would be a state-owned entity that would maximize for the state. And it's continued on with all the lawsuits that have continued against Bonneville Power Administration and others. Bad will is out there, and it's got to be fixed. But once this is all done, the first thing that I think that we really need to do is really have a Western grid that is all integrated without seams in between. Second, we need to take a set of things that allows the demand side to operate, the behind the meters. That involves, I think, much more of the real-time pricing, and time of use just doesn't do it. It's got to be moving towards the real-time pricing. So when that happens, there will be some incentives for some people to put in fuel cells on their side of the generator. Others will have smart software, and the market will handle it. If I have the moment to tell just a quick story about something I learned as I was waiting to go into this session and talking about one of the vendors here.
You got a minute.
Good. And I was saying, with the real-time pricing, nobody's going to watch it. You need the software to control the system and get the people out of the loop, and it's going to be software. So, and here was a software provider for the supply side. I said, boy, it'd be work on the demand side. She said, well, she's talked with the clients, and some of the things they want them to do that will help the grid will hurt their bottom line. And so they don't do it. They don't pay for the software that would really be good for the grid because it'll hurt their own bottom line. Now, if you had the prices compatible with the marginal value on the grid, what would help the grid will help their bottom line at the same time, and they'll invest in that software, and you can take people out of the loop and move forward. So when I talk about allowing the markets generally to really work, I mean regionally across the West, and I mean at the demand side level, so that we can allow software controls to optimize and move forward and get an incentive compatibility, which we just don't have now on the demand side of the market.
So Carl, what's on your 3x5 card recommendation to the industry about how to go from the broad vision, inspiring vision that you all have laid out for this dividend to actually begin to make it happen?
Well, you know, I don't disagree with a lot of what has already been said in terms of that, but I will just note that, and I know Michael Liebreich's going to speak to this group later, the risk of stealing his thunder. You know, he wrote an article several years ago about the things we needed to do to actually make this transition we're in the middle of, and it involved really innovating in a variety of different fields. And what we're hearing is changing direction in how we operate the grid, changing direction in how we operate the distribution system and the demand side of the system, really having to make some steps, but having the ability to do that. There's innovation happening in technology, there's innovation happening in communications, there's innovation happening in business models. Utilities have to change their very business model, and it's occurring right now. So all these different things are happening in real time. It's kind of like building the car as you drive it. We need to think a little bit further ahead. I think that's one of the most important things we need to do is plan for a more orderly transition to the extent that we can, but also move forward. We've been experimenting with all sorts of issues with the adoption of storage in California, and the ability to manage these systems differently in the distribution level. That's many massive investments are going to be required in order to make that happen, to do the kind of automation Jim was talking about. Yeah, we can do that, but we have to be willing to take that step and realizing there may be some costs today, but over the long term, that those are going to finance lower costs in the future. If we build a transmission system that's expandable later, and we build it to places where we know the renewable energy resources are rich, as we've done in the READY process previously, we're going to get good value out of our transmission system. It may mean we have an open position on towers in the Central Valley as we do a line like Gates to Gregg to open up that vast solar resource and create jobs in our state, but creating jobs for export. So having the transmission infrastructure to facilitate that is a longer-term play than just what, for the next 3 years, the load needs in the Fresno area may be. It's a different kind of planning, and it needs to be tied into what we're doing now. A little longer-term vision.
So, Steve, what are we missing in the to-do list?
So, two things. One is sort of the obvious one when we talked about politics earlier, and I'll just jump right to the chase since I know we're approaching the top of the hour. But you know, in California in particular, we need to get over ourselves and pass some clean legislation to get to 100% carbon-free grid and get to a regionalization governance structure that makes sense. So try to remove the politics from that. Impossible almost, but that's one easy one. The one thing, though, I think is missing in terms of this discussion, it's just something to leave you with, and I know the regulators in the room will particularly, this should resonate with them. The challenge of translating the sort of pure economic argument of things like real-time pricing to the real practical aspect of setting rates for consumers in particular. Businesses, I think it's smart to think about businesses as a separate entity from consumers. But when you think about consumers, you know, we all love the idea of real-time pricing, and we all sort of wave this sort of magic wand around and say, well, everybody's going to get a Nest thermostat and it's going to communicate with the grid, and they'll be able to turn your air conditioning down when prices spike in the late afternoon, early evening. It's probably not going to happen. You know, people don't want to be their own home energy managers by and large. They just want to come home and turn the light switch on and have the light bulb come on, or the dryer come on, or the stove come on. So I think it's the challenge of trying to transition from the current rate design system that we have to one that sends signals without being punitive about it. And there was a really nice piece over the weekend in the New York Times on surge pricing as a social trend. The obvious catalyst for this discussion was Uber and their surge pricing on cars. But it's a popular topic that's permeating almost everything, and including electricity pricing. And there was a long stretch in this article about the shift toward time of use pricing and real-time pricing. Time of use pricing, I agree, really, really imperfect, almost sledgehammer kind of approach where something much more precise could be practical. But I do think that it's dealing with that reality, translating the pure economic arguments that we all love, that this conference is, and the people in it are particularly fond of having that conversation, but translating it to something more practical. How do regulators actually deal with as the interface essentially between the consumer and the grid operator, and the consumer's interest in just living their lives normally with the grid operator and the utility's desire to become much more efficient at what they do.
So you want a system, a set of contracts potentially at the macro level, but you want a system in which people can be actors in the system but not necessarily have to be players in the system in the same way that generators and intermediaries and demand-side aggregators may have to be. Here's my question. You know, I said earlier that this was about connecting strategy and practical effects. Most of you in the audience, I assume, have had some role, as I know all four of you, in developing strategic plans for one kind of organization or another, whether it's a nonprofit advocacy organization or a large business. And I don't know about most of you in the audience, but my sense is that most of the strategic plans that we tend to get involved with sort of fall into the trap of expecting our futures to be the anticipated projection of what we already know in the past. And it led me to create a little phrase that I called the Molbau zone. That's not a German phrase, by the way. It's an acronym, M-O-L-B-A-U. And that's more or less business as usual, because that's where most of us tend to think we're really talking about strategy. My question to you, my final question to you is, 2 years ago, a year ago, 3 years ago, this issue of the duck chart would have been about possibly curtailment, right? It would have been, oh my God, we're ducked. Now it's really the question of how do we get the most bang for the duck in terms of using both the surplus that we have, but also dealing with the paradox, Mark, that you described earlier. What's your overall sense of optimism about capturing the benefit of the dividend that we've been discussing? Let me put it in numerical terms. 10 is it's going to happen, absolutely. In the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to come back, have a panel like this, and by God, we're already receiving some of the benefits, significant benefits of the dividend. And 1 is, this was a lovely panel. We talked about a sort of crusader's vision of a brand new world where people are thinking ecumenically and people are working seamlessly with one another with transparent pricing. But that's just not going to happen. Where are you on that scale of 1, ain't going to happen, 10, absolutely? Mark?
I'm at least an 8,
Whoa.
probably closer to a 10. And it will happen, but it won't happen in probably the same ways that we predict it will happen. And I think that's because technology will evolve faster than we can keep up. And I think as a result of that, it will happen, but we won't know exactly how we will transform other things to have it occur.
So
but if you say 10 years from now, will it happen? I think it will not be complete. It'll be portions of it we'll start to see coming through, and we'll see some new opportunities created in that time period.
So there's an implicit guideline in there in terms of the policy frameworks and decisions that players make in the industry, and that is sometimes serendipity trumps strategy. And we need to make room for serendipity to happen, whether that's in the form of technological innovation or ingenuity inside organizations or what have you. Jim, what's your score on this one? You've seen this picture evolve over a relatively long period?
At least 8, but I really want to qualify that because we've been talking about the second most important thing that's cleaning up our economy, and we've been really mostly silent on the first most. So let me give you a statistic for the U.S. as a whole. Since 1973, at the time we had the oil crisis, we've decarbonized the U.S. economy. That's what I mean by decarbonize, carbon per dollar of real GDP, by 65%. That is, our carbon per unit, per dollar of real GDP is now 35% what it was in 1973. Of that 65% decarbonization, about 59% has been energy efficiency. 6% has been the combination of wind and solar and geothermal and nuclear power and hydro and fracking for natural gas all put together. The supply side of the energy market has not been cleaning up our energy nearly as rapidly as we have continued to do on the demand side, on energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is going to continue almost independent of what happens in Washington, D.C. these days.
So you would basically...
So I give the high number. Now is the time for the renewables to start catching up to energy efficiency. So in 5 years we can say we're talking about the first most important, Because so far, we're only talking about the second most important.
So Mark, I think Jim's suggestion on this chart behind us is we eliminate all the satellites and just keep focusing on what gets to the center here, with energy efficiency having a place among the quartet that we have up here. Carl, what's your vote?
Well, I certainly agree with what Jim just said. I mean, energy efficiency is the cornerstone of everything that we're doing. We're living on the benefits of that. He's also right that we're going to be making extremely, I think, pretty big strides coming years in the way that we produce and generate and distribute electricity to customers, businesses. That's going to be, I think, the really big transition in the economy. Also, I think there's a major trend occurring towards this regional coordination. We're seeing all the RTOs in the country expand. We're seeing in the West states aligning to join RTOs or to join markets like the EIM. This is an extremely positive development because it prevents waste in the system that we need to improve in and get better at.
And that's the rationale. What's your score?
My score is about almost a 9, I would say. And the reason, if I may, is just that the trends that really empower the shift are well underway. As I mentioned before, coal is not coming back. No one really foresees that. The prices for renewables continue to drop. NRDC just published our 5th annual energy report. Some of the data that Jim just mentioned are contained in that. For the first time since we've been keeping track of this, energy costs per household are at the lowest level that they've ever been. We're starting to really see these shifts take root, and the long-term investments in utility companies, in businesses, in industries are driving a lot of this, not necessarily national policy where we've tied ourselves in knots.
Steve, I don't know whether to call this a tiebreaker or not. We've got a very optimistic trio so far.
Well, I think, and I am as well, but I will say your question was very specific. You said 3 years from now. 3 years, I'd give us maybe a 6 or a 7. We'd be on our way. 10 years, yeah, 8 or 9. I think without overplaying it, I think there's a sense among all of us, and I think probably a lot of folks in the audience, of inevitability of this. It's just the natural right thing to do. It's the thing that we have to do. So the question is, will we do it more quickly, or will we kind of stumble along the way? And I think 3 years from now, we're still going to be dealing with a few issues, shall we say, but by 10 years, I think we should be in great shape.
So Tom, when he introduced us to begin with, the whole session said that this is the 9th annual symposium. And I was thinking, if we were running the film back 9 years, I suspect much of this discussion would have been more in the category of what if. What if we could do X? What if we could do Y? What if we could get penetration of renewables up to a level of 10, 20, 30%, whatever it may be? Now we're shifting from what if to what's next. And I'm curious, before we let you guys go, you've been talking at these folks. Let's get a quick sense of your answer to that same question I posed. Assume it's 3 years for the moment. You've now heard about the possibilities of this dividend from basically political vision, courage, technological innovation, Silicon Valley ingenuity, luck, whatever it may be. All 4 of these panelists have discussed is of a strategic level. It's big. It's available if we can get the kind of alignment that we're talking about. So put yourself, let me give you a little bit of change. Let's talk about it in 3 to 5 years, all right? 3 to 5 years. How many of you, on that same scale of 1 to 10, 1 being ain't gonna happen, and 10 being absolutely it's gonna happen? We're on the road to inevitability within even that period of time. How many of you are 1s? Raise your hand, don't be shy, even though we've got a panel up here with higher numbers. 1s, I don't see any 1s. Boy, this is an interesting group. How about 2s? 3s, raise your hand high so people can get a sense from all over the room. 4s? 5s? 6s? 7s? 8s? Now you're in compatico times here, right? 9, 10. So hopefully that will make for some interesting conversations during the networking session, which we're going to adjourn to right now. First of all, please join me in thanking Steve, Mark, Jim, and Carl.